Hello again, world. It just dawned on me earlier today. I was scrolling the gram and people were talking about shout out to Osho. If you don't know Osho, either just Google him real quick or the wildest introduction you could get to Osho would be to watch the docuseries Wild Wild Country. It's a Netflix original, therefore code word for a Netflix exclusive. But at any rate, so with all this grand conjunction business, if you spoilers, you should watch Wild Wild Country. And then I'm gonna pause so you can stop and go watch. It's a 6-part docu-series. Each episode's an hour long, so it's like a 6-hour commitment. I think it's worth it. People who know me know I'm basically obsessed with it, and that's okay. I think it's a great story. The narrative of the documentary, well, documentary is narrative. The narrative of the documentary is great. It's dramatic and super compelling, and regardless of how dramatized and I can't find the word I'm looking for, but yeah, of course things have been edited to paint things a certain way. That side of it is awesome. Even if you scrub out the extra potential editorializing and the narrative imposing that the creators of the film or the work, the creators and the viewers, regardless of that, the factual stuff that it's a preposterous enough story, for whatever dramatizing or sort of sensationalizing that might have gone on, even if it's a lot, the facts are still so bonkers and bananas. So it's good in that way. And at any rate, so hopefully by now, if you're watching this and still here, 3 minutes in, you stopped and it's been several days later, or maybe just 6 hours later. Maybe you binged the whole thing and now you're back. The point of my video here is to chuckle at the fact that Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh had intended to leave his body on July 6th of 1985. He wanted to leave on that so-called Master's Day. And as it happened, he was delayed from that. But turns out he ultimately did leave his body on January 19th of, I guess that would have been 1986 probably. And that's funny because January 19, 2021, I believe that's 58-ish years later. Or wait, no. He died at 58 years old. I don't know where my brain just weird random Wikipedia fact just blasted into there. It's 30-something years, 35-ish years later. But the point is, in 2021, January 19, okay, Vedic astrologers will pick a bone with this, but I don't claim to be involved per se in that. This is a sort of a Western astrological moment. But so dates aside and degrees of things aside, it's very interesting that on January 19, 2021, the sun moves into Aquarius in real time of 2021. We have the solar ingress. The sun is moving into Aquarius, crossing the degree of the Great Conjunction from 1221. So, for all of Osho's efforts at ascending on a Master's Day, July 6th, his plan was thwarted, and he ultimately ended up leaving his body on January 19th, the following year. But then if you fast forward to today, well, gosh, he managed to leave his body on a day that's not insignificant. This January 19, 2021 is like intimately connected to that grand conjunction, which everyone made a big deal about, which Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh would have probably absolutely enjoyed. But of course, we divert to the story again briefly. Because I trust that you have caught up and watched the whole thing like twice by now, you recall that Manand Sheela makes the suggestion that even leaving on the 19th was actually, that was not a natural thing, that he chose to leave that day. And then you go, well, to poo-poo her story, you would say, well, why would he pick then? Like, why wouldn't he try to make it to July 6th like he'd already planned? Or why wouldn't someone should look up what, well, I guess that was just a cultural thing, probably. It was probably something to do with the guru culture of India, if I had to guess. I'm going to have to look that up. At any rate, it's interesting to think that if he chose to leave the body January 19th of 1986, that knowingly or not, he ultimately made an active decision that made it such that the day he left his body then, if you fast forward to 2021, or to 2021, because of the final kind of major astrological event of 2020, that grand conjunction, it's like, that may not have been his reason why. He maybe was not like, oh, I want to leave my body on the day that in 30 some years will be the day the sun crosses over the degree that hosted the grand conjunction of 2020. But whether that was his rationale or not, if he made a conscious decision to leave his body on January 19th, if that was a planned thing by him, then he ultimately did do it on, the day that all of that stuff would add up. The sun moving into Aquarius on the first degree, the same degree that Jupiter and Saturn were conjuncted at before. Seems like that's probably honestly, I give the guy the credit. I give Osho the credit. I wouldn't be at all surprised. So here's where it gets even trippier, right? Because in a way, everything we need to know about what's happening right now politically in America, we got to see it in action in that docuseries. We see it pretty clearly, like whichever side you choose to make a protagonist, ultimately the thing kind of comes out as like a draw. It seems like it seems like a relative cosmic draw. To an invested party, maybe you would feel one way or another, like the townspeople, they, in their minds, maybe it's like this was a real solid win. Like we actually we won. And if you're from, the Rajneesh, you might easily be like, boo, we lost. Or you may, just kind of do the like self-righteous thing and be like, well, look, we've got like our thriving community. We're still like this global power in a way. And if these people want to have their little podunk town so bad, they can have it. We don't care. We've got this big global community and this, you know, there's like an industry around that whole thing, that movement. Because it was, it was kind of an economic, political thing. Like it was an economic entity ultimately, and it just got so tied in with all the other stuff. But there was an economic component to it from the get-go. I just sidetracked myself pretty good here. Oh yeah. But so it's interesting to think that, you know, if basically you could make the funny argument, this might still be a new tangent. This might be a fresh tangent, but you could make the argument that what America is experiencing politically right now is, I won't say like, how do I phrase it without being unduly, you know, wacky about my reasoning, like, um it wouldn't be surprising, right, if you grant Osho or the Bhagwan, if you grant him like some cosmic weight, which, I mean, look at it. You technically, if you're being honest, you have to grant some. It would not be that surprising, knowing how that esoteric, mysterious, cosmic side of stuff works. It's hard to assume otherwise, that like a lot of what's happening at this moment is, not without his hand in the pot, so to speak, right? And without him having sprinkled something in, to act like he's the sole architect of it. That's a little bit, again, all due respect, that's a little ambitious. That seems a little bit like, hey, like there's a lot of energy already, like beyond, you know, beyond a man. But so it's completely uh, feasible that Osho, in his spiritual might, whatever of it there really was, with his siddhis, which he, again, clearly did have. Look at what he built and was a part of building. But using those powers, using that energy, he's able to tap into this grand conjunction and just kind of like stir the pot. Again, like to think of it as that whole drama of Rajneesh Puram as being a Gurdjieffian device, so too, like the current political tension in America is sort of just a Gurdjieffian device. Um, so I feel like personally, and again, I'm weird, but at least for the sake of self entertainment, just to hypothesize it, like I'm pretty comfortable with the notion that uh, Osho has sort of like helped to orchestrate all the madness that's going on. All the tension is, again, sort of a Gurdjieffian device that he is all too happy to put everybody into. And then the extra funniness of it becomes, well, if that's true, is it done the way you would like to think that it is, which is to say like that you know, he is the good guy in this. Like the Bhagwan sob story side of the Wild Wild Country narrative is authentic. Like, it is true that he's really like this high spiritual being, and he really is doing this uh for an ultimate good, right? Like, it is an attempt and kind of a gentle or a very uncomfortable nudge of the whole world to be like, wake up, like, we really do need to be all the stuff that the Aquarian age ultimately represents, archetypically or archetypally, I think. um so yeah, it's like, I'd kind of like to think that, like, that's so palatable, right? That feels pretty good. Like, huh, yeah, maybe there's a method to this madness. The other side of that is to think, okay, well, he sort of has had a hand in orchestrating this tension politically. Um, it is or could be seen as this Gurdjieffian device, but it could be potentially, right. Like, if we buy into the sort of townspeople centric narrative of Wild Wild Country, then we start to go like, well, maybe this is the Bhagwan creating this like madness as like political revenge, because he did feel like he genuinely felt sort of like betrayed by the political system here, the legal system here, sort of. um it's like personal, right? He has an attachment. He feels so wronged. He feels like it was such a misuse of the justice system. He feels like it was an injustice. He feels that so strongly that he's like, I am going to twist this country up in such a way that it could potentially completely fracture, you know? And we sort of did see, right? Like, the culture wars that are currently ongoing in the country, like, that is essentially that the same divide almost that they came up against. It very much is. Like, it's so similar in terms of like the kind of conservative white, you know almost like negatively quintessential American versus this like, oh, open-minded, so so woke and like so hip to everything, this like global minded, we're all united under Osho. And you've got radical immigration. Like, it's the same fault line in a way. And if it, it's just it's interesting, like, how that is. There's just like this real clear correlation if you're looking at all with any kind of like objectivity and rationality. And it's even more interesting to think, again, like, if you allow yourself the fun of exploring like some of the wilder possible ideas about things. you know the Rajneeshis had this moment in the 80s where they really dominated that town. They did. They were in control, dominating it for about 4 years, and ultimately they were kind of smushed by the behemoth that is the United States legal system, justice system, however you want to think of that. The government. Really, it's the judicial system, because I don't think there's any like law. The legislative branch had little to do with that situation, and the executive branch had little to do with it. It was this weird criminal justice legal system side of it that was really everything was tangled up in. Well, sidetracked myself again. But yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting, and it's fun to think about the idea that this was orchestra. Oh yeah, I remember. Um, so yeah, for that brief moment, like the Rajneesh were really like flexing on this little town, and then ultimately they kind of got smushed out by the true big fish. And now, as we look, at the situation we're under, similar vibes, except for the past 4 years. Interesting, 4 years again. For 4 years, for the past 4 years, we've seen the sort of this exaggerated caricature of what people want to think that the townspeople in Antelope, Oregon sort of represent, which is this conservative, white, sort of, sure, a little bit clannish. And yeah, maybe even a little that kind of clannish. But for the past 4 years, they have really kind of had a bit of a, they've been able to kind of swing their weight around, you know. So that's kind of peculiar to think about, how it's like it swung kind of the Rajneesh way then. It swings a little bit more in the antelope type direction right now. And it's interesting because, again, either like the resonance of this is sort of like a revenge moment, which would be kind of an ironic one, I guess, because if he really wanted that, you would think if it was sort of revenge based, that the Rajneesh-ish oriented types, right, would really be the ones dominating. And I guess in a way they are. Like, technology, the big tech thing tends to sort of favor that, to kind of lean that way, it seems. I don't know. This is getting beyond my pay grade, I suppose, but yeah, it's curious to think, like, whoa, what if what if he was like, man, America, like, you guys lamed out on me, so I'm gonna make sure that you have to deal with some down the road. Maybe that's why he picked that January 19th, because he's like, yo, in 2020, come 2020, they're gonna have gone through a lot. And there may yet be plenty to go, right? Which, I don't know. Again, if you give credit, if you give Bhagwan, see, and that's even uncomfortable, because if you're educated in the cultural kind of stuff, not everyone knows to take that term for what it is in that context, but plenty of people do. So we'll say Osho. Osho easily could have opted to leave his body on that day, knowing full well that this resonance would be there. And if you give the guy credit, if you're giving Osho what you could argue is the due credit, then those 4 years are like important, because they showed us both the possibility, like the positive things of that movement, think episodes 1 and 2, right? Where it's like there's some tension, but the overall story is quite a glorious one. Like they've built Eden. They've built the Garden of Eden. And they're, if you're to take their word for it, living sustainably, even like, well, I forget what the term is, but like, it's like reparative or whatever, reclaiming land, like reclamative farming or whatever the term is for that. You're not just sustaining the biosphere of like where you're at, your environment, you're actively like really helping it thrive. That's cool, and like we do need that. And again, that's very much indicated in this sort of Aquarian, vision, if you will, of the world, this Aquarian age. So for 4 years, or over the course of 4 years, there was the chance to sort of see, hey, like, look, this can be done. And then we also got to see, during those 4 years, the reality that, how we do that, and the kind of like cultural landscape that needs to be navigated, really has to be, those issues have to be dealt with. We can't just enforce you can't enforce a utopia, or it's inherently a little bit dystopian. So we got to see that, we got to see that if you don't address those things on the front end, you end up in conflict. And if you don't bring a true spirit of understanding, of compassion, of, all the stuff that somehow is like radically missing from sort of the elites of the organizations, then you end up in trouble like that. Like, I'm sure some of the people, some of the devotees, right? Like, probably some of those devotees, you gotta figure a few people out of all of the people who are involved in that scene, like, are truly like hip, like they truly get it. There surely is a few. You'd have to think, right? And yeah, sidetracked myself again. Just sometimes your brain just, it's like the channel turned in the middle of whatever you're watching. It's just click. Oh, that station's pure static. Nothing there. Nothing there is everything there, right? So shout out Osho, I guess. Kind of both literally and in the more simple context. Yeah, it's interesting that those 4 years in Oregon sort of played out. They really show again. They highlighted literally the culture war fault line that we're standing on right now, and all the players back then showed us that there were not enough people involved who were really as woke as they thought they were. Everyone in that situation who really had like a lot of skin in the game, you can just see it the way they, or again, maybe that's a little bit editorialized in, like that might be narrative production, but it seems like they really do. A lot of them came across with a lot of kind of self-righteousness, both the townspeople and the Rajneesh. So it goes to show, I mean, essentially we're reliving that moment. And the question is, did we get any closer as a people to overcoming the things that ultimately undermine that situation? And the answer appears to be a rollicking no so far from a lot of people. But chances are that it's not as bad as it seems, because the internet has manipulated things. Like if that situation had been happening today, and again, I guess maybe my argument ultimately that I'm discovering that I'm making is that it is the same. It is the same situation right now. And we're seeing that with the technology there, it is far worse. And I think it's worse also because it's no longer like this external force, right? That culture war isn't being played out as an external force versus the internal existing kind of like community. We're seeing that culture war fought now literally inside the host, right? Like the government itself, the United States. The singular monadic political entity is being affected by that same culture war, by that same fault line. So it's like rather than these two sort of battling tribes, this is truly like an internal conflict. It truly is like a civil war, but it's so culture driven, and that's what's sort of ironic, is that again, like, it's the same culture fault line that was battled against back then, and we didn't seem to get any more hip to like how to navigate that. We didn't. Both parties ultimately failed in that grand experiment, and it's interesting to see that fault line expressed again. Doesn't seem like we're any better off. But you just kind of hope that if there really is some like cosmic involvement and sort of spiritual power involvement to it, like, man, I hope my optimistic estimations of Osho are valid and accurate, because if so, I think that's like really a good, then this whole thing is maybe really actually headed in the right way, even though it's pretty sketchy at the moment. It may not need to really come to anything. It got so heated already, but maybe it does not need to continue to escalate. Maybe there's a way for us to kind of get off the ride. And I think, in the 30-ish years that have transpired since that original 4-year period, like, man, hopefully enough people have kind of, the impact of that has been evolved and worked with to a degree that maybe maybe we can find a way to bridge that cultural gap and to ultimately end up with a situation where we get to really kind of have the best of both worlds. Like the sustainable agriculture, the community, that sense of belonging, like all the genuinely positive things that occurred hopefully we can find a way to have that without having to sacrifice, the sort of antilopian ideals, to the extent that there are some good, like if you're in denial about what's good about what they were about, you're kidding yourself. The other side of spirituality, like the Rajneesh kind of represented like ecstatic, wild enlightenment, and the people of Antelope really kind of expressed the calmer, the very like, pastoral kind of, ironically, the much more gentle um, kind of form of enlightenment. You know, all players involved in that story ultimately come across as quite self-righteous and snide, which many of us continue to do today. I'm not giving anybody a free pass, but um, but yeah, like the enlightenment on both sides was real and valid, and that's the whole problem, is that in pursuing the same thing, these two different cultures are highlighting polarized aspects of it. So you end up with the appearance of a radical conflict, like an irresolvable conflict. And the only reason it's irresolvable is because, seen from the right angle, from the right dimension, or however you want to say it, from the right perspective, there is no conflict. There's different ways of expressing freedoms. There's different ways of expressing justice. There's different ways of expressing community. There's different ways of, going about things. I sort of lost my, I don't know if I even really had much of an angle going there, but I feel like it's the duality thing. The people of Antelope, the Rajneesh, in a way they wanted the same thing. They wanted their idea of, comfortable community and belonging, but they ultimately kind of pursued culturally things so differently. The Rajneesh were not quiet people. They were sort of loud and wild by their nature, and the people of Antelope were calm, quieter types. Again, that's where it feels like ultimately nobody won or lost, no matter how much, various egos are talking about this power dynamic of somebody won, somebody lost in that situation. But I think the highest perspective, the God perspective, the sort of holy take on the situation, is that you took two different forms of worship, two diametrically opposed, right? Kind of approaches, two extremely contrasting cultural value sets, and threw them together. It's like you took the tribe that speaks in tongues and dropped them right in the town that, where they observe, where they're under like permanent holy silence. And then you had a fight about like, why aren't you responding with words to us? And like, why are you screaming at us? And, the sense of like, we're going to keep on screaming, in the sense of, you guys are so loud, you're destroying what we do, which is the same thing that you do, but you're you're really harping so much that it's, it's like what the way we've been doing it, like we can't do it now because you're, in the case of like noise and silence, any noise disrupts the silence. That's how noise works. You can have like a bunch of different noises, but if you're after silence, adding more noise is going farther away from what you seek. So it's not like it helps. And that's kind of the situation. That's the situation with these culture wars, is that they create those kinds of dynamics where it's like, you know, it gets to this sort of intractable point. And it would be one thing if, that's, this is going into weird territory that I kind of don't like, but I'm technically not afraid of, but I'm not going to go there right now because ultimately this has already dragged on for so long, and all I really wanted to do was have a chuckle about the fact that that it's possible that Osho chose to die on a day that in 30 some years would be the day that the sun entered Aquarius in the tropical astrological systems, and that would be the degree of Aquarius where the grand conjunction had occurred recently before, and he just kind of wanted to get his hands, he just wanted to have some, he wanted to be able to like come and mess with us. Maybe for good, maybe for bad. Either way, in an interesting way, I guess. So, whatever. I've rambled way too long. Bye, Internet.